Now we're recording. Yes, it is, isn't it? Okay. Just waiting for it to share screen here. All right, just bear with me. The share screen stuff's not working. Up there we go. Okay. Okay. We're ready to rock. Here we go. All right, we're going to talk about hell. Give them hell. We're going to focus on what's called GE-HINNOM, part 2, and what Ruach Hakodesh meditation has to do with that. How bad do you have to be to get to hell is our question. And we'll finish up with some best practices on dealing with distractions for your meditation. Okay, just to show you where we're at in our studies, we've studied various techniques. Here we are at Ruach Hakodesh, also known as enlightenment. Very common topic, very misunderstood topic. We're going to go over the Torah's view of that. We've already reviewed Rabbi Kaplan's premise that there's really a three-component soul, nefesh, ruach, and neshama, and that there has to be certain personality traits developed in order to transcend through these levels and become enlightened. And these personality and traits include study, carefulness, diligence, cleanliness, abstention, purity, piety, humility, fear of sin, and holiness. We then expanded this idea with the studies of Ethan Dorshav, and he talked about there really being a four-level soul. The basic level is the physical end of the soul. The plant sphere, and then we have the water sphere, and below that we have the wind sphere and the fire sphere. And it's interesting to note that everything basically is a soul. We are living in a soul. Our world is a soul, and the physical realm is a variety of that. And we've talked a little bit about, you might consider it to be like energy. Is energy a wave, or is energy a particle type of thing, depending how you look at it? And we talked about how there's a recycling, how there's an integration of each sphere with a larger environment when you die, crowning with our neshama, connecting with God's neshama somehow. We're going to keep studying that. And though we now need to know a little bit about what happens on the micro level. On the macro level, we have our soul, so to speak, integrating with a larger soul of the world, whatever that means. But what happens to you, the individual, the person that died? So we started out with Rabbi Kaplan, asking questions like, are you your body? Are you your brain? Are you your memories? Where do you go when you die? And we talked about God's memory, how your memory gets integrated with God's memory. There's once again that whole principle of the smaller integrating with the larger. And then we talked a little bit more about immortality, the purpose of the brain and nervous system being a filter. And we talked about the mental activity of the disembodied soul, looking at yourself, standing naked before God, meaning that you use your brain and nervous system when you're alive as a filter, not just to filter out the overwhelming stuff of the larger environment, But internally, we use our brain and nervous system to suppress ideas, emotions, experiences, feelings, memories that we don't want to pay attention to. But when we die and the physical part of us becomes integrated with a larger whole, then we don't have the filter anymore, and we're confronted with all the stuff we had been suppressing and ignoring and rationalizing away. And he uses words about burning shame and judgment. So we're kind of focusing on that. What do you have to, how ashamed do you feel? You know, there are different types of shame. Does everybody feel the same kind of shame? And remember, we're trying to tie this in, excuse me, to the meditation of living, meaning that using meditation to develop personal qualities in yourself. So does that mean that how you live affects how you die? Does it mean that if you live a certain way, you end up with less shame and you have a better experience dying? That's where we're heading with this. Otherwise, why bother to live a certain way? Okay. We then continue with Rabbi Kaplan, and he talked about, do the dead know what is happening in the world of the living? And he used various sources to maintain that there's a post-body awareness, that the you, whatever that is yet, and we're trying to define that, persists past the body and sees the body. The body is the main source of attention. You become so used to your body that when you die and you somehow emerge from the body, at least get through that level, then you're aware of all kinds of stuff that you had been aware of, and you got to focus somewhere, so you focus on what's familiar. The body becomes a refuge from this disorientation. And there's the idea that the more attached you are to the material, the harder it is to let go of the material when you die. The less attached, the easier it is. But remember, we're talking about obsession. We're talking about strong attachment. It doesn't mean that those people that choose poverty have an easier transition. That doesn't mean that people that are poor are more spiritual. There are many wealthy sages. There have been very wealthy sages that are extremely spiritual. They're not attached to it. They're benevolent. They're generous. They're charitable. They're not attached to what they have. So that's a point to make. So in a way, the preparation in this world is for that world. We took a deep dive into Gehenna, according to Rabbi Kaplan. And we used his quote, a number of our great teachers write that the fire of Gehenna is actually the burning shame one experiences because of his sins. We find that evil leads to shame. So we ask the question, what sins are evil? How does the pursuit of Ruach Hakodesh help us avoid these sins? Okay. And remember, Rabbi Kaplan told us that Ruach Hakodesh, or enlightenment, means transcending the physical through work on yourself and developing these personality characteristics. So then we went to Judith Antonelli, a Jewish scholar, and who is very, very good at using multiple disciplines, multiple fields of study to get an insight into the benefit that Torah living gives us, including sociology and anthropology and psychology and ancient religion and so on. And we took a deep dive into evil with her, and we discussed child sacrifice, and we discussed all the various forms of, all the various cultures of child sacrifice, of people believing that if they killed their children, they would benefit somehow. And we posited that that is real evil. So we're now working on the premise that this kind of stuff, worshiping false gods who demand that you kill your children, and along with those sacrifices, and there's sexual perversions and sexual excess and idolatry and murder. The big three of idolatry, murder, and sexual perversion are all wrapped up into this pagan worship. And Therefore, we're classifying that stuff as evil, and that we're therefore saying that that's kind of like the opposite of what's supposed to be happening with Torah living. With Torah living, we're supposed to be able to get on track with the right values and the right, and worshiping the right God, the God, in the right way, and treating people they deserve to be treated, and so on. That's the importance of all these personality characteristics that we're supposed to develop in order to become enlightened. So you could see that lifestyle and the religious lifestyle is key to whether you're committing evil or not. And if you're committing evil, then your time of dying is much worse than if you're not committing evil. Okay. But is that the only kind of shame? I mean, do the evil people, the people that are doing this horrible stuff, are they the only people that feel shame? Okay, because we feel shame. You know, I feel shame I did this. You know, we have relationships with others and we feel shame. So are there degrees of shame? Okay. So for today, we're going to start addressing that point. And there's a publication called the Jewish Encyclopedia. Actually, it was published in 1906. So it's an oldie but goodie, and that has a lot to say on this GE-HINNOM, which now, as we learned from Judith Antonelli, has an actual place in Israel. Okay, and it is a place where these pagan cultures did these evil things, and they named the place after that. Okay, so in the Jewish Encyclopedia, that text is echoing the same kind of research that Judith Antonelli presented. It is talking about the place in Israel. It is talking about Moloch worship, where there's this fake king, where people are sacrificing their children to that king in order to get something from that fake king. And remember, king and God are synonymous with these cultures. So the Jewish Encyclopedia is echoing the same research that Judith Antonelli presented to us. And the Jewish Encyclopedia is mentioning that it became to be known as hell. Again, because that is the place where a lot of this evil stuff took place. Okay. Further on in the Jewish Encyclopedia, it's making these statements: adultery, idolatry, pride, mockery, hypocrisy, anger. These things lead to Gehenna. These things put you in hell. Hell awaits one who indulges in unseemly speech, who follows the advice of his wife. We're going to get into that for a second. But there's other things that preserve man from going to hell: philanthropy, fasting, visiting the sick, reading the Shema. Okay, eating 3 meals on Shabbat. Okay, now, is this actually saying that things like unseemly speech and pride and hypocrisy and always following the advice of your wife, is that as bad as child sacrifice? No, that's not what it's saying. And you can see here, there's a comment at the end. It would seem that the expressions doomed to hell and to be saved from hell must be interpreted hyperbolically. A bad woman is compared to Gehenna. Okay. All right. So it must be understood, and all these quotes are from the Talmud. It must be understood that the Talmud is a recording of very scholarly conversations that took place over the course of 60 years. And scholars from all over the land would get together and talk about Mishnah, talk about Jewish laws, talk about Jewish principles, talk about the Jewish way of living. And the Talmud is a recording these conversations. But you have to understand that a lot of these times, these conversations are meant to provoke thought. So when there's a flat out statement that says, well, if you listen to your wife too much, you're going to go to hell, that kind of statement is not to be taken literally. some scholar is saying that to provoke thought, like we're doing right now. So, for example, if we've already established that things like child sacrifice and these huge bloodthirsty orgies worshiping fake gods, if that's evil, and that's what gets you to hell, so to speak, that you burn in GE-HINNOM, that state after death, then when a scholar says, yeah, well, you're listening to your wife also does the same thing, that's a provocative statement to make you think. And what it's doing for us, it's making us think, are there degrees of badness? And will that really get you to hell? So I think it really needs to be understood that when the Talmud makes these kinds of statements, it's statements of scholars that you don't necessarily know the context. We weren't there at the table to hear the rest of the story. So some guy, we didn't hear that the other guy say, what are you talking about? They're not, listening to your wife is not child sacrifice here. Come on. So, we got the tip of the iceberg here. And even though the Talmud has a lot of give and take, it's not a recording of all the conversations that took place months out of every year for 60 years. So that must be understood. So the Jewish Encyclopedia is giving us some examples of references to GE-HINNOM in the Talmud, but it's not to be taken literally all the time. As it says itself, it's supposed to be taken hyperbolically. Okay. So I think it's safe for us to conclude that there's a lot of things for which we should be ashamed, and you should be ashamed. If you are rude to somebody, you should be ashamed of that. But that's not the same thing as burning it in hell for those people that are doing the really evil things. Okay. So can you objectively say that there's little degrees of shame and therefore little bits of burning, and large degrees of shame and as much more intense burning? I think we're definitely on that track. Okay. And today, what we're going to do is try to illuminate that a little bit by asking a question: is it true that the further you are from God, the hotter the flame, and the closer you are to God, the lower the flame? Okay, so the role of God in your life could influence the type of shame you feel if you do something wrong, and therefore what kind of experience you might have when you die. Okay, and to get some more information on that, we're going to look at an essay he has called from a book called Inner Space, which is this. Okay. In this particular section of the book, he's talking about the prophet Ezekiel, and who was quite an enlightened person, and this vision he had that was recorded. And we're not going to get into the vision, but we're going to talk about Rabbi Kaplan's commentary on the vision. Okay, this is what he says. Okay. He says, imagine that you are meditating on a very high level and are just about to achieve prophecy. So again, he's linking meditation to prophecy. Every thought and memory is lucid and transparent, and you see yourself for the first time without the static and jamming that shuts out most of our thoughts. So he's also making a reference to how our nervous system is acting as a filter. Imagine you start feeling a closeness to God and realize that God knows everything about you and everything you ever did. You are standing naked before God with your memory wide open, completely transparent, without any jamming mechanism or reducing valve to diminish its force. You remember everything you ever did and see it in a new light. You see it in the light of the unshaded spirit, or if you will, in God's own light that shines from one end of creation to the other. The memory of every good deed will be the sublimest of pleasures and most delightful bliss imaginable. But your memory will also be open to all the things of which you are ashamed. The wrongs you committed burn, and they are very painful, but it is worse than physical pain. It is not even like a psychological pain that you could hide or run away from. There is no possibility of rationalization or dismissing it, no escaping it. It is a pain that is just there. Furthermore, you don't even want to hide. You realize that this fire and this shame are cleansing you. You are so totally open that you begin to appreciate the necessity of this pain, because it makes you realize how really far away you are from the divine. According to this, we can understand why the Ari, one of the greatest Jewish Kabbalists and philosophers, says that Ezekiel experienced the fire of GE-HINNOM. This is a spiritual shame that cleanses a person of all his impurities. Fire burns because there is too much sensation. A concentrated amount of any sensation, light, sound, or touch, is painful because it brings too much stimulus at once. Thus, the reference to fire, understood as an overabundance of stimulus, could point to the increasing sensitivity of the would-be prophet as he sees himself being totally purified. Okay, this is heavy mystical stuff. But here's what's important as I see it. The phrase that says, furthermore, you don't even want to hide. You realize that this fire and this shame are cleansing you. You are so totally open that you begin to appreciate the necessity of this pain because it makes you realize how really far away you are from the divine. Okay. So somebody is experiencing the shame and they're looking at their deeds, good and bad. They're feeling bad because of the bad stuff they did, but they're actually saying, oh, this is good because you know what? As I work through this shame, I'm getting closer to God. And that's where I want to be. Okay. So this is, somebody can only perceive their burning shame that way as really being a positive if they've been educated and they lived in such a way to treat life that way, to treat their experience in life that way, to have this idea of God as understanding and forgiving, to understand that you have to go through bad stuff eventually to emerge at the end intact and whole and closer to God. If they don't, this is somebody, so to speak, whatever the somebody is defined as is, this is somebody who gets it and who has a right understanding of what it means to live with God and try to have a relationship with God. Okay, and there's still shame because you're not perfect and you're trying to get it right and you fall short, but your attitude, it's almost like you have an attitude here. Your attitude is that I got to go through this. I got to go through this burning in order to be able to get closer to God, which is the main objective here. Okay, so to show how, let's contrast this. Let's suppose that you're one of these pagan idolaters and you've been sacrificing your children, and all your neighbors and your friends have been sacrificing their children and having these blood orgies as part of worship. Okay, this person has a much different mentality. This person is not going to go into their experience after death with this idea. They have a completely opposite idea. They're probably in for a huge rude awakening because they're going to realize that's not how it works here. They're really far away from God, the real God, and how God wants you to live. So I'm going to put out there the idea that these people, because of the way they have lived and the way and their worldview, their burning is going to be really hot because they haven't had the the attitude that, I've got to eventually, I have to work through stuff in order to get closer to God, the real God. So I'm imagining that those pagan idolaters, that when they're dying, they're in for a really rough time. Eventually, I guess maybe they'll get it, but there seems to be some kind of diversity of ideas where some commentators say eventually they'll get it, even the worst evildoers. But there's another one that says, no, they never get it. So I'm not sure where we're going to land on that. But the point is, how you've lived is helping you cope with your experience when you die. And those people who are living like truthfully the way we are with the Torah, even though we've got some stuff to be ashamed of, we work through it because that's how we're supposed to be living. But those people that are on the opposite side of the tracks, who think they inhabit a completely different world where there's evil king gods that just demand blood, they're in trouble. Okay. So now, one last point about this. Okay. He says, according to this, we can understand why the Ari says that Ezekiel experienced the fire of Gehenna. This is a spiritual shame that cleanses a person of all his impurities. Okay. So the question here would be, is it possible when you have really enlightened people like Ezekiel the prophet, do they get to understand what death is like even for evil people, even though they're not leading evil lives? In other words, does somebody get so enlightened that their experience of death is not just them working through their leftover stuff to get closer to God, but can they actually understand what death is like for somebody who didn't live like that and lived their whole life far away from God? So is his prophecy induced by this really strong meditation? Is it allowing him to really understand what it's like for the other side to die? Maybe we'll find a source for that, but I'm not ruling out that enlightenment at that high level can actually allow you to experience that. So he does say, Rabbi Kaplan, the shame of being far away from God and the fire of Gehenna is the same fire with which God reveals himself during the highest peak experience. So looks like he's answering yes to that question. Looks like he's basically saying that yes, at that point, the enlightened person can see both sides, that fire is fire, and that you get to see and appreciate what it's like for others who lived differently than you did. Okay. At this point, it gets to be pretty mystical, so we're going to put that on hold. Okay, so I think that after this study, we're able to conclude that how you live is definitely influencing how you die, and that if the way you live is bringing you closer to God because you are attempting to develop qualities that allow you to transcend the physical and become more spiritual, thereby getting closer to God. And you're using all the various forms of meditation that help you do this, then you certainly are not perfect. And when you die, you've fallen short, and you do have some things, though. You have some unfinished business that you're ashamed about, but because you've lived with a certain way of, you gotta, to get through it, you gotta go through it. You take that attitude, so to speak, and you work through your shame with a positively to get closer to God when you die. And we're also saying that people, though, who live life far away from God, and again, I'm not talking about people who choose to be secular. I'm talking about people that are doing evil, doing the exact opposite of what God wants. They probably have a much harder time, because the whole idea of being close to God really is foreign to them. So they have a lot of catching up to do. And whether or not they complete this reorientation is debatable. Some commentators say, yeah, this burning in hell has a defined time limit, and other commentators say, nope, you're stuck. And the last thing we're questioning is, and maybe we're saying, is that those people that get a highest level of enlightenment, and there appears to be certain levels, can, even when they're alive, they can understand what it's like for people, not only when people who live the good life die, but even the people who live evil lives die as well. So that's obviously a very advanced idea that deserves much more time and attention. Well, there you go on that one. All right, so let's get the meditation book. And we will talk about the distractions, how to deal with distractions. Understanding distractions. Distractions come in all sizes, shapes, and flavors. Buddhist philosophy, and again, he's a Buddhist, and he's definitely talking about an approach to meditation, however, that's very consistent with the Jewish approach. Buddhist philosophy has organized them into categories. One of them is the category of hindrances. They are called hindrances because they block your development of both components of meditation, mindfulness and concentration. A bit of caution on this term: the word hindrances carries a negative connotation, and indeed, these are states of mind we want to eradicate. That does not mean, however, that they are to be repressed, avoided, or condemned. Again, he takes a mindfulness approach. You can't just push the problems aside, go away, go away. You have to work through them, be mindful of them, and the more you're just aware of them, and yet you kind of cut them down to size by your awareness. That's how you get rid of them. Let's use greed as an example. We wish to avoid prolonging any state of greed that arises, because a continuation of that state leads to bondage and sorrow. That does not mean we try to toss the thought out of the mind when it appears. We simply refuse to encourage it to stay. We let it come and we let it go. Again, he's focusing on, we have the power to choose what thoughts to stay with and what thoughts to let ride. We make a choice. We make a deliberate choice to say, I'm going to think about that as opposed to this. When greed is first observed with bare attention, no value judgments are made. We simply stand back and watch it arise. The whole dynamic of greed from start to finish is simply observed in this way. We don't help it or hinder it or interfere with it in the slightest. It stays as long as it stays, and we learn as much about it as we can while it is there. We watch what greed does. We watch how it troubles us and how it burdens us. We notice how it keeps us perpetually unsatisfied, forever in a state of unfulfilled longing. From this firsthand experience, we ascertain at a gut level that greed is an unskillful way to run your life. There is nothing theoretical about this realization. All the hindrances are dealt with in the same way, and we will look at them one by one. So we're going to go into that the next time. So he's saying you really develop the skill to say, oh man, I'm really lusting for this, or I'm greedy about this. And you see what you're like when you're feeling that way. You have that objective view of yourself. It's like, oh, look what that greed does to me. Man, And the more you are aware like that, the less power that has over you, and you have more power over it. You can just say, I'm going to let it go. And you become a less greedy person in the process, simply by being mindful of it during a meditation. And on that note, we are going to meditate.